I'm going to talk about ecological physics and the perceptual information for motor control. I'm not a kinesiologist. As some of you know, I have no training or qualifications in kinesiology whatsoever. I've never taken a course in kinesiology. I have no degree. Now that you know that, if you wish to evict me from the academy, that's up to you. But I am a behavioral scientist, and I mention this to you because I come at kinesiology as a newbie. And I look at this and I say, so what is kinesiology, and you know, what's going on here? One of the things that I have been pleased to see as an explicit part of this is kinesiology being a field that brings scientific methods to bear on the organization and control of human movement. As in other aspects of behavioral science that address similar questions, kinesiologists have sometimes argued that aspects of movement were ballistic or pre-planned, also known as open loop. This was, as I'm sure most of you know, the dominant view of things about where movement comes from for a very long time. But nowadays, it's widely accepted that most, and perhaps all movement, actually is guided. That is, it's controlled in real time on the basis of perceptual information. This is more or less equivalent to the concept of closed-loop control. If we accept this sort of contemporary view of things, and that is to say, if motor control actually relies on perceptual guidance, then it becomes fair and appropriate and ultimately necessary to ask questions about the nature of the perceptual information. That is to say, what is the perceptual information that supports movement? So I'm going to give you a general argument about how perception works at all, ever, anywhere. But I'm going to do it in this case with a focus on movement and the perception and control of movement. One fact about perception, or one claim about perception that is so common that we rarely think about it, is this idea that perception operates through what are commonly referred to as channels of information known as the senses. For thousands of years, we have taken it for granted that perceptual information comprises inputs obtained from several channels or senses. The classical list is sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. In recent decades, scientists have sort of pointed out that there's also this less obvious thing called orientation. So the classical list of 5 senses plus 1. Each sense is tied to a particular type of ambient energy, or is assumed to be tied to a particular type of ambient energy. Orientation, generally thought of as being related to information obtained from gravitational forces. Sight obviously gains information from light, hearing from sound, touch from mechanical forces, and so on. Again, the point here is this concept, this very ancient assumption that perception comprises a set of different channels. The assumption goes on down to levels of anatomy and physiology. Each sense is assumed or believed to have anatomically different receptors with corresponding afferent nerves. Again, orientation relating to the vestibular receptors that connect to the vestibular nerve, and the list of receptors and nerves there, I'm sure, is familiar to everyone. If we accept this venerable ancient assumption, then control of movement is accepted as being based upon these energy-specific senses. So if I'm going to control the orientation of my body, I'm going to use the vestibular system and the forces on which it relies. If I'm going to control locomotion walking around, then I'm going to use probably sight. By now, almost everybody knows what optic flow is, and the fact that optic flow is generated by your own locomotion and can be used to detect and control your own locomotion. Conversation is an instance of audition, from the so-called speech perception literature, we have nice descriptions of the patterns of sound that constitute formants for different words and so forth. And And again, the list goes, you just go down the list. Yet at the same time, despite these numerous and well understood examples, at the same time, we are also aware that some perceptual information seems to be available to multiple senses. Or another way to put this is that perceptual information about certain things seems to get into more channels than one. Speech is a nice example, and there's a large and increasingly influential literature in so-called speech perception that focuses on the fact that speech alters not only the stimulation of the ears, but also of the eyes. So we look at the speaker when we can, and what the speaker is visibly doing very powerfully affects what we quote, hear, unquote. Another good example is locomotion, which of course affects optic flow, but also influences the stimulation of at least two other types of receptors, those being the ones in the bottom of your feet as your feet hit the ground, and the ones in your vestibular system as you translate the head through space. So on the one hand, you have these nominally separate channels of sensory information. On the other hand, you have this sort of self-evident fact that lots of real-world things affect more than one system. How can we account for this? Or what kind of a story can we tell about it? And in trying to answer that question with respect to the information that we actually use to organize and control movements of our bodies, I will begin with some history. A fellow named Aristotle. Assumptions about the existence of multiple senses, about the assumption that we have different senses, go back at least as far as classical antiquity. I think by that what we mean is that these are simply the first written records that survive. Aristotle wrote about this and was quite clear and quite direct. He accepted the classical list of senses. He said there are 5 senses: sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. But he, excuse me, he didn't simply list them. He directly addressed this issue of the fact that there are some things that seem to be unique and some things that seem to sort of smear across. And he made this claim. Aristotle claimed that there are 2 categories of perceivables, 2 separate categories of perceivables, which he referred to as special objects of perception and common sensibles. Aristotle defined special objects as things that are available to only one sense. And he gives lots of nice examples. For example, color. You cannot hear color, you cannot feel color, you cannot smell color. It goes only in the eyes. It is unique to vision. And special objects, again, things that are available to only one sense, and that he contrasts with what he refers to as the common sensibles, which are things that are available to multiple senses. And he gives some nice examples here too, and these are a little odd, you may have to think about them. Magnitude. So in vision, you can have things that are brighter or darker. In audition, you can have things that are louder or softer. In touch, you can have things that are heavier pressure or lighter pressure. In smell, you can have things that smell strongly as opposed to weakly, and so forth. So magnitude. Number, so you can see 4 things, you can feel 4 things, you can smell 4 things. And time. It may seem odd to think about detecting time or sequence with your nose, but you can do that. Anytime you go to a wine tasting, you're doing that. So again, you have this claim made by Aristotle that there are these 2 separate categories of perceivables, those that are available to one sense only, which he refers to as the special objects, and those that are more or less equivalently available to multiple senses, which he refers to as the common sensibles. Well, Aristotle was a long time ago, and we have sifted through, I mean, Aristotle made gazillions of claims about gazillions of things, politics and morality and all the rest. And a whole lot of Aristotle, we've sort of said, well, you know, that's nice, but probably not. And yet there are aspects of Aristotle that we retain, that are with us in the present tense, and this is one of them. The Aristotelian concepts of the special objects of perception and the common sensibles remain current. They are, excuse me, they are now mainstays of theory and research on the perception and control of ordinary movements and ordinary interactions with the environment. Moreover, the existence of multiple distinct sensory systems is still taken to be self-evident. Aristotle just said, yeah, here's these 5 senses, what do we say about them? And that's what we do now. The existence of separate senses is taken as a given. It does seem intuitive that information for perception and control is sometimes unique and sometimes overlapping. For most of us, that seems very intuitive. Nevertheless, there are problems with the Aristotelian view, or at least it's possible to identify features there and claim that they're problems. And I'm gonna nominate just 2 of them here. First, so Aristotle claimed or established these 2 categories of perceivables, the special objects and the common sensibles. First issue, is there any principled or law-based basis by which we can distinguish special objects from common sensibles? Aristotle was a chatty guy rather than an equation guy, and he just sort of gave us this idea and gave us a bunch of examples, but he did not offer a classifying principle. For anything that may be perceived, anything that may be perceived, is there an a priori way within the Aristotelian system that we can determine whether it counts as a special object or a common sensible? Aristotle did not give us any help on that. The second issue that I want to talk about is that the Aristotelian narrative assumes that each sense is operating or is being evaluated separately. He takes it for granted that the senses are as separate as our intuition tells us that they are. Moreover, as so many perceptual scientists have done for so many thousands of years, he tends to talk about each sense as operating alone. So he talks about things that may be seen, full stop. And then he talks about things that may be heard, full stop. And he talks about things that may be smelled, full stop. And he rarely spends any time talking about the fact, I say, that we hear things at the same time that we see things. We smell things at the same time that we taste things. A simple way to put it is that all of the so-called sensory systems are always operating. They're always on. You don't turn them off. So the scientist can choose to focus on only one of these, but the living, operating, perceiving creature is always dealing with simultaneous stimulation of all systems. And yes, you can close your eyes, and that's about the only exception you can come up with. So stimulation is always multisensory. Whether we choose to analyze that or not, it is the case, but it does motivate some questions, and I put one down there. How do the senses relate to each other? And I'm going to try and talk about this in terms of physical laws, per my title. In traditional theories of perception, the relation between external energies, things like light and sound, and physical reality is claimed to be ambiguous. That is, the traditional claim is that the stuff that gets into your eyes and gets into your ears is not deterministically related to the events out there in the world that caused it. So you strike a match, the match generates photons, the photons go through the air, they get into your retina, and under traditional theories of perception, it is claimed that there is not a lawful relationship between the photons at your retina and the photons that came from the match. Not a product of physical law. If this is true, if this traditional claim is true, then accurate knowledge about the world, and therefore information adequate for accurate control of movement, cannot be obtained from sensory stimulation, but must be constructed or processed in the brain. I'm taking it for granted here, what I hope you will all take for granted with me, that we actually do have accurate information in our heads. So I can reach out and pick this thing up, in part because of the kinds of things that Mark talked about, but also in part because my eyes, my perceptual sensitivity, if you will, tells me that the glass is right there, and lo and behold, it's right there. My perception of the glass and of my arm in relation to the glass. Those things are accurate. So if the stimulation available to sensory systems is intractably ambiguous with respect to reality, then we have some splaining to do, given the fact that we seem to have pretty accurate knowledge about what's going on. And as I say, under traditional theories, this accurate information has to be constructed or processed in the brain, and that ultimately is the origin of the concept of information processing. Information processing as a claim about knowledge relies on logical operations, the combining of symbols and the constructing of representations and so forth, things in the head, which again I call logical operations, and as I distinguish them here from any operations that might be constrained by physical law. So you can think anything you want. You can have inside your head anything you want. You can have inside your head a model of a unicorn. There aren't any unicorns out there. To the best of our knowledge, unicorns would be a violation of physical law, but they're not a violation of logical law. So I'm trying to establish a qualitative distinction between the laws that govern logic, and there are laws that govern logic on one hand, and the laws that govern physical reality, which are quite different. Oftentimes, simultaneous inputs to different senses are not redundant. That is to say, they suggest incompatible facts. And this is the real crux of the problem. If my visual system is telling me that I'm doing X, and my vestibular system is telling me that I'm doing Y, and my haptic system is telling me that I'm doing Z, then I have a problem, at least potentially, because it appears in that case that, well, they can't all be right. I'm only doing one thing, and if I'm getting different messages from different senses, then there seems to be a problem. Within traditional views, when this happens, the brain is alleged to act to, quote, resolve this conflict, unquote. James Gibson argued that perception is not based upon logical operations. Gibson argued that perception is based upon physical law. And I like to put it in these terms because I think that that helps to establish just what a change Gibson was asking for. He said, sorry, maybe it's not the logical operations in your head. Maybe we can have a perception that's based upon physical law. He claimed that patterns of energy that are available to the senses are constrained by physical, not logical laws in such a way that they do bear a determinate and veridical relationship to facts in the real world. So he just said all the stuff we believed about the ambiguity of sensory stimulation for the past few thousand years, forget it, toss it, start over. Physical law that influences animate behavior, Gibson named as, gave the name of ecological physics, and that's the thing in my title. Well, when Gibson made this claim, it was absurd because it flew so obviously in the face of all accepted thinking. But one thing is quite clear: if Gibson's claim is correct, however unlikely it may seem, if Gibson's claim is correct, then perceptual information could be sufficient in principle for perception to be accurate. And the stuff getting to your eyes and your ears and your fingertips and so forth might be enough for you to have the accurate knowledge that you actually demonstrably have. If that were true, then available sensory stimulation would not need to be processed, added to, adjusted, or etc., but simply picked up or detected. Gibson's work motivated a search for parameters of sensory stimulation that might be compatible with physical law, and correspondingly which might be formalized. That is to say, captured in mathematical formalisms, as physical law is captured in mathematical formalisms. And Mark gave us some nice examples of that. And this search has borne fruit, and most of you have some familiarity with at least some of these. The really famous one is optic flow. Optic flow, it can be hard to remember that back in the 60s and 70s, when optic flow was a new idea, that it seemed absolutely incoherent nonsense to most people. It seemed absolutely incoherent nonsense to me and to many of the people that I worked with. And it took a long, long time for folks to sort of get used to this idea that there were patterns in visual movement that could be described mathematically, that existed outside the head, that could be picked up by a detector, such as an eye or two eyes, and that might provide accurate, determinate information about anything at all. As I say, optic flow nowadays is pretty widely understood. So we have equations for optic flow, and we understand pretty much what it means to suggest that it has a lawful determinate relation to walking down the street, for example. A more recent example, which has somewhat more complex equations, but which is coming into pretty wide acceptance, is wielding. When you hold onto a rod and shake it around, you are activating a physical thing called the inertia tensor, which is a property of physical reality. And the equations that define the inertia tensor are quite complex, but they arise as a determinate function of physical law. And we know from wonderful research that people are exquisitely sensitive to the quantitative parameters of these equations. These parameters exist outside the head. Optic flow is outside your head. The inertia tensor is outside your head. These equations can be used to generate experimental stimuli. The equations for optic flow can be used to generate scenes in movies like Star Wars and so forth and so on. It's worth noting that most of the visual effects that you see in contemporary movies come from mathematical equations. And if you find them compelling, well, that's worth thinking about. The equations can be used to make quantitative predictions about perception and control, and lots of empirical research supports the hypothesis that we actually have perceptual sensitivity to these parameters. Well, so Gibson talked about this stuff. He claimed that these things existed, and you have the examples that I've just given you. And these things, these examples, have been brought to us in the context of individual senses. That is to say, within the assumption that there are multiple senses and that they're distinct. Well, what about relations between the senses? What about situations that traditionally have been interpreted as conflict or intersensory conflict? And a nice example, which I will refer to again in a minute, is the car on the highway. So if you're in an automobile and you're driving on a straight highway, a flat highway at a constant velocity, 70 miles an hour, maybe in a 55 zone, if you're going at a constant velocity, your visual system is getting lots and lots of stimulation. That's the optic flow. And that optic flow is, courtesy of physical law, is providing information about the fact that you're on a highway and you're going a certain speed. Because you are going at a constant velocity, the forces available to the vestibule suggest that you're stationary. There are no changes in forces. By definition, if you're going at constant speed, you're not accelerating, so nothing's happening in the vestibular system. Traditionally, this situation, this utterly common situation, is interpreted as my eyes tell me I'm moving, my vestibule tells me I'm stationary. You put those together in the head and you get a conflict because they suggest states of the world that cannot simultaneously be true. So these situations appear to violate physical law. You cannot be moving and stationary at the same time. My question is, can we reinterpret these kinds of things in such a way that they might in fact be compatible with physical law and with what we refer to as ecological physics? The traditional assumption of intersensory conflict requires a further assumption that input from different senses are compared internally, as I've already indicated. Very venerable, the concept of multisensory processing, but not necessarily the only way that things might be. We offer an alternative interpretation of all this. We claim that physical law establishes determinate relations between light, sound, forces, and so on. That is to say, we claim that there exist patterns in ambient energy that are superordinate to light and sound and other forms of energy. If you have patterns that are superordinate to forms of energy, then you're going to have emergent higher order patterns that extend across forms of energy. These higher order patterns comprise what we call the global array, and I'll give you a very specific example. This is the car moving at constant velocity down the highway. We start over here. The dotted line is inertia, which is 0 because you're moving at constant velocity. The solid line is optics, which is very high because you're moving at some non-zero velocity. So you have visual flow corresponding to your physical velocity and inertial nothing corresponding to the fact that you're not accelerating. If you press on the brake pedal to slow down, you will generate some inertial force. So you get a change in inertial stimulation, and pressing on the brake pedal will bring about a change in the optics. In the traditional interpretation, these things are appropriately graphed like this. This graph makes the assumption, this graph embodies, if you will, the assumption that vision and the vestibular system are qualitatively separate, that they are understood separately, that they're graphed separately, mapped separately, interpreted separately. And you can see that this curve is nothing like that curve. The pattern available at the eyes differs qualitatively from the pattern available to the vestibular system. So look, they're different. It's obvious they're different. And the only way to figure out that this means that you're slowing down is to combine them in the head. Well, you can change your outlook on this qualitatively by simply redrawing the graph. Here we again have time, but we've now made it a three-dimensional graph rather than a two-dimensional graph, and the optics and the inertia are simply axes within the same graph. And lo and behold, when you do that, you get not two qualitatively distinctive patterns that must be combined in the head, but you have the emergence of a single unitary pattern that extends across optics and inertia. That pattern exists. That thing is not a hypothesis, it's not a claim, it's out there. The question is not whether that pattern exists, the question is whether, two questions. Number one, does that pattern actually tell us in a determinate way what's actually going on? That's one question. The second question is, can we detect it? If the senses operate in the separate way that we've always assumed and believed, then we can't detect it. Well, my claim is that there exist patterns in ambient energy that are superordinate to light, sound, and so forth. Well, we're accustomed to the existence of perceptual information in emergent higher order patterns that extend across receptors. Optic flow is a good example. Another one is stereoscopic depth. Working together, the eyes, which then are called the binocular system, can access physically determinate information that is not available to either eye. Similarly, in audition, acoustic information for location of sound sources, you close your eyes and localize sound really, really well. This is because working together, the ears form the binaural system that can access physically determinate information that is not available to either ear. And as I'm running out of time, I'll simply skip to the example of this, which comes from Gibson's 1966 book, our nice little blobby organism. You have here receptors that detect deformation of the skin. You have here a simplified vestibular system. When the animal is sitting on a flat surface, then the direction of this is the same as the direction of that. When the animal is sitting on a tilted surface, the direction of these things goes with the orientation of the surface, but the vestibular line, if you will, is still pointing down. There is a so-called discrepancy here, and Gibson just pointing out that the discrepancy is information. The discrepancy is information. If the discrepancy can be registered, the organism will be able to detect a fact about reality, that is to say, the slope of the ground. This, to the best of my knowledge, is the first example in the literature of this concept. Working with Benoit Bardy and some other folks, we have tried to implement these ideas in terms of experimentation. This is a description of an experiment we did with a virtual reality setup. So this is the screen here, and obviously this is an observer, and this is the virtual target, which is presented at a virtual distance. When the head is in motion, so we had a condition where people moved around, as people normally do, and the system was updated in real time. When the head is in motion, you have the inertial forces that are generated by head motion, and you have then the changes in optics that are presented over here, and the relationship between those is uniquely related to an object at a single distance. When you take away head motion, if you just record these optics, and you have a fixed person, you take out the inertial component and present the identical optics, they are intractably ambiguous with respect to depth. If you ask people how far away is the object, in the top condition, they're very accurate. In the bottom condition, they're not. The optics are the same. The only thing that differs is the relationship between optics and other stimuli. Very rapidly here, again, this concept of formalization in terms of physical law. The screen shows several formalizations that can be obtained from literature. In each case, different terms in these equations, and this is the key point, in each case, different terms in these equations structure different forms of energy. So you have a term in there that's affected by optics. You have a term in there that affects inertial force. You have a term in there that affects torque. And these equations simply describe and define higher order emergent relationships between these forms of ambient energy. Every one of these requires movement. Every one of these is defined only for a moving observer. And that brings about the very important fact that patterns in what we call the global array come into existence only when you're moving. And certain types of movement will tend to optimize certain kinds of patterns. And again, we've done some empirical demonstration of this with skilled observers. If it is the case that certain types of movement optimize specific patterns, then you have a situation where skilled movement will allow you to have more accurate perception, because skilled movement may generate exactly the parameters that you need in order to get done the job that you're trying to do. So to conclude, the body obeys physical law. I hope we will all agree with that. Under traditional theories, perception has been assumed to be constrained by logical laws and not by physical law. This disjunction, and I point this out to you as a disjunction, this disjunction between the body and the mind has been problematic for understanding how perception is used to detect and control movement. The new view that we're offering suggests that perception may be constrained by physical law in exactly the same way as the body is. Ordinary movement changes, ordinary behavior creates changes in patterns of ambient energy, but in addition, changes emergent patterns that extend across multiple forms of ambient energy. These emergent higher order patterns constitute what I call the global array. These are patterns that are determined by physical law and do not rely on logical or processing operations in the head. Patterns in the global array have been formalized, and experiments suggest that what I call the perceptual system, that is to say the nominal channels all working together, is directly sensitive to them, and I claim that this is the actual information that supports motor control. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Can I